I'm not entirely certain whether this event really happened to me. It could have been a dream, or I may be remembering something Rick once told me, but I feel obliged to write about it nonetheless. In this memory, it was fall, and I was walking around town in search of some Saturday evening pastime. I then happened upon a faintly familiar restaurant/bar that was more into the, let's say, aesthetical side of things. It was a comfortable place that I recalled sometimes visiting, as it lacked large crowds of customers and was illuminated with shadowy floor lamps and other suitably moody lighting. All in all, a sufficiently respectable establishment without going over the top with its artistic thematicalities. As I stepped through the open doorway, I noticed the usual patronage already settled at their late evening drinks, most of them sitting around round wooden tables, engaged in silent conversations over various alcoholic beverages. A heavy smell of tobacco lingered in the air, dense fluffs of fog refracting light from the sparse, mellow lighting, creating quite a comfortable atmosphere. A traveling musician was performing in the far corner, I noticed, playing faint melancholy tunes, no doubt well rehearsed after years of practice. I inhaled and looked around once more, taking in the ambience, seeing that little had changed since my last visit. I then straightened my jacket and proceeded towards the bar stand in order to get a drink. To my fortune, the area was void of customers. The barman was idly loitering behind the stand, listening to the lone musician's music, absent-mindedly cleaning a large glass with his suspiciously clean towel. Although this was more an act rather than any productive activity, I suspected, for dishwashers had surely reached even this old-fashioned establishment by now. I leaned against the creaking wooden stand and coughed, gaining his attention. "Can I have a beer, please? And can you tell me who is the tonight's musician?" He put aside the glass and took a new one from the shelf behind him. "Funny you should ask that, miss, since, being honest, I don't know his name." "Yes, you see, our original artist had to cancel tonight's play at the last minute, and we were left with no other option than to, well, employ his services." His nonchalant demeanor was a bit informal, but I paid no mind to it. After all, I'd become a regular patron at this point. He continued while pouring beer for me, occasionally glancing at the new musician. "Yes, and so this fellow came to me and asked quite casually whether I needed any entertainment to be performed tonight. I asked what he'd charge, just to humor him, and he said, word for word, 'Perhaps a beer for a song, would that be fair?' Needless to say, such an offer was too good to refuse. He handed me my drink with a smile. "And he's pretty good, don't you think? Suits the place?" I took hold of the cold beer and answered with a smile of my own. "Very much so indeed." I left the idling bartender to his non-existent duties and proceeded nearer to the musician. There was an open seat with a small table, not too far from the stand he was performing on, and so I settled myself there and sat for quite a while, listening to his somber tunes. The music was indeed fitting for the place, particularly for this late autumn occasion, wherein most of the trees had already shed their leaves, and those still clinging to a few had turned them deep blood red. It was not hard to lose track of time in this place, in this moment, as I sipped my beer in silence, deep in thought, as the lingering tobacco smoke obfuscated my senses, while the talented musician kept playing on, apparently improvising on the fly. Eventually, however, he announced a momentary break and then swiftly disappeared into the back rooms. I took this as a sign for my own brief lavatory visit, as I noticed I had quaffed the beer empty while contemplating the world in an artistic daze. I left the empty glass on the table and stood up. As I looked around, I noticed some of the patrons had left, the small, shadowy area seeming sparser in customers, which I thought as little odd, as usually more and more thirsty individuals slowly slither in as the evening progresses. I shrugged and proceeded towards the toilets, which were located beyond a short, secluded hallway. Having concluded my business in the well-maintained restroom, I walked back towards my seat, only to notice it occupied by someone. It was a hunched man, sitting his back to me, having his hand on the empty glass I'd left on the table. He was apparently staring idly at the, now, empty stand where the musician had recently performed. While I thought this man's behavior as quite rude, it was most likely an honest mistake. And so, I paid no mind to him initially, instead went for the bartender to get another drink. He was still cleaning that same old glass, but upon noticing my arrival, leaned to get a new one behind him. "Did you see that fellow walk in?" I asked, pointing at the man sitting at my table. The bartender glanced at the direction of my pointing finger. "Oh, who, him? No, I don't think so." "You were sitting there, right? Is it a problem?" I waved my hand and smiled, saying my thanks, then took the beer and turned around. For some reason, I wanted to talk to the mysterious new customer who had taken my place, as there was something familiar about him, something that I couldn't quite pinpoint, but felt veritas nevertheless. Thus, I proceeded at the table and coughed slightly from his side. He seemed oblivious of his surroundings, still staring at the empty stage, as if watching some invisible play reveal before him. After a second cough, he slowly turned to see me. I noticed him being about my age, perhaps a bit younger, with rounded glasses, hazy eyes, and a thick, haphazard beard. "Yes?" he asked, his hand still on my old empty glass. "Excuse me, but I think that's my seat." He looked around a bit bewildered, as if he'd committed some great misdeed. I quickly continued. "But it's of no issue. You can stay there. Mind if I join you?" He glanced at the seats, then at me, giving a faint smile. "Oh, I suppose." It appeared that this new fellow was a man of few words. He seemed like the type that was not accustomed to unexpected female attention. I walked around the table and sat down, then offered to shake hands. "My name's Mia. Nice to meet you. What's yours?" He slowly looked at the empty stand once more, ignoring my extended hand, and then slowly turned his head to me. You can call me Westman." He coughed and looked down. "Dr. Westman." I retracted my hand, smiled, and took a sip of beer. "Well, nice to meet you, Dr. Westman. Could I ask you from where you are? I assume you're not one of the locals, since I haven't seen you here before, and—" He raised his empty glass and looked at it, suddenly saying, "It seems like this one's empty. Mind if I order a new drink?" I nodded, and he stood up awkwardly, too fast, knocking his chair back, but then proceeded to the bar stand, walking a strangely limping gait. Soon, Dr. Westman walked back with a fresh beer, and, without much eye contact, sat on his, formerly mine, seat. He took a few nervous sips before returning to his earlier stance of staring at the empty stage, seemingly having forgotten about my presence. Feeling curious to pry more out of this elusive man, I again started with a preluding cough. "So, where are you from, Dr. Westman?" "I come from the north. A small village in the woods, you wouldn't know the name." He gave a brief glance, but quickly returned to look at the stand again. I continued. "I see. Well, so what made you come here? Business, or are you on a vacation?" Suddenly he blurted out, "Sophia. I'm in search of Sophia." Had I known the significance of the name at that time, I surely would have taken the situation more seriously. Now, due to my ignorance, I thought his words a bit peculiar, but ultimately of not much importance. "Is she a friend of yours?" "No, she's much more than that. Well, my apologies." The ambience around the bar seemed to have quieted. The mild chatter that usually filled the place toned down to almost unheard levels. I glanced around and noticed only a pair of elderly men sitting in the far corner opposite to us. They were quite drunk and paid no heed to us. I faced back towards Dr. Westman, who seemed to have taken a new, strange spark to his eyes as he stared forward over the empty performance stand. There was something, years ago, something that I saw in the woods. It begun with dreams. Dreams of a woman with silken hair, or not even a woman, but a figure of a woman. She was... At first I thought she was just the product of my overly active imagination. But then I saw her outside of my dreams, one time in the woods, one late autumn night. He stopped to take a long drink of beer, and then lowered the glass back delicately. He smiled, sad, melancholy, full of apathy and unnecessary apologies. "I'm sorry, I tend to lose my train of thought. Pay no mind to whatever this is. I'm not quite myself this evening." feeling like there was something more to this strange encounter, something that made me certain no chance alone was responsible for our meeting. I urged him, "No, please do go on. It sounds rather interesting. You say you've been visited by this image of a woman?" He suddenly looked straight at me, leaning in. "Not just visited, but he glanced around. But chosen somehow. I know how it sounds, quite foolish, but I cannot help but feel like... I'm sorry, I really shouldn't talk about this. Well, like this at least." He coughed. "Although I guess it won't matter, since it's unlikely we'll ever meet again. I can try explaining with more clarity after I get a new beer. That is, if you're still interested in these crazy old man's ramblings." His notion about being an old man seemed a bit funny, considering he looked, at most, at his late 20s. Nevertheless, I nodded, feeling at awe about his sudden change of wind, and I was eager to hear more, for there was a story to tell, I sensed. I couldn't fathom the significance of it at that time, as I mentioned earlier, but later in life, when Rick told me all about his strange excursion into Mr. Gloom's mortuary of melancholy, and my subsequent experiences in the winter of White's End. But in any case, that's all in the past now. Back in the bar, the ambient tobacco smoke felt to have cleared a little, now that the place had emptied of customers. An occasional drunken slurring emanated from the outside, where various drunks passed by in search of better pastures for their pastime. As to why this particular establishment did not draw any of them in remained a mystery. I glanced at the bar stand, where the bartender was serving his third beer for Dr. Westman. I then looked behind me and noticed the two elderly men vanished as well, having left their half-emptied glasses on the rounded table. Then finally I looked straight ahead, at the performance stand, which remained empty. What was taking the musician so long? Was his delay the reason people were leaving? Or was it us, somehow, spoiling the atmosphere with our strange musing? It seemed unlikely, but then again. I awoke from my thoughts as Dr. Westman pulled his seat back and sat down, placing his now full glass of sparkling bronze-colored liquid on the table. "Now, where was I?" he began, as he adjusted his chair. Sophia, my search for her, you see, He hesitated, looked at the stand's empty air, then at me, retaining his spark, but now with certain restraint of mental acuity. "A few years ago, during an intense period of parapsychologic studies, I had a vision of sorts. Now, I understand that this may sound rather grandiose, but I speak of sincere heart, I assure you. These visions, for a lack of a better term, consisted of a fleeting image of a woman, as I've already explained. Perplexed at the time, I later learned that this woman was a representation of something else entirely, rather than the actuality of some real person of female gender. What exactly it was would remain vague for quite some time, unfortunately." He took a sip of beer, as did I. The world seemed to dim around us just a little. I became fascinated with this image, obsessed even, delving into psychology of esoteric arts for a possible explanation for this now recurring vision that plagued me. It took considerable time of investigation, but I finally formed a hypothesis. It went as such. There are certain hidden consistencies within man's psyche, shared, common recurrences that have been with us for millennia, embedded within the genetics, passed down in generations since time immemorial. What purpose these serve exactly is of not concern here. The important fact is that they're real, in a sense, albeit only in the psyche. Their existence only in the subjective realm does not diminish their effect, however, as they are very, real, as said, and their actions behind her scenes have profound effect on our lives." He drew breath, staring forward, as if speaking to himself. "When I say real, I mean in the confines of human psyche, and you'd be entitled to think me as mad for suggesting otherwise. Yet, I cannot deny what I've seen. What I've seen, one time in the woods, was, no less than one of these ghosts in flesh, a vague figure of a woman, as I've explained. A manifestation of a primordial psychic force, somehow crossing the bridge of the immense chasm of subjective and objective. I hope you can understand my shock upon encountering such a miracle, something that I thought was only, His words trailed off, but he then suddenly inhaled sharp and continued. "I'm unsure if this has made anything any clearer. I've traveled through various towns now in search of this figure, this primordial force that I witnessed and named as Sophia, for reasons too lengthy to go into now, but I think she's the animating spirit, if you're familiar with this concept. To see such a thing in actuality, I do not know what repercussions it might have for earthly sciences, since, as you may know, the objective and subjective worlds are thought to be irreconcilably separate, unable to influence each other, a grand chasm separating them with no possible bridging ever to be conceived, neither by computer nor canvas. I heard a door swing behind me with a distinct wooden creak. I shifted around in the seat to look, but saw nothing out of place. When I turned back, Dr. Westman had assumed his earlier stance of stoic staring at the empty stage, and seemed now adamant in holding his silence. I thought of his words, Sophia, Sophia. Had I heard of her somewhere before? I could recall not at that moment, but his enthusiastic tone had made me question my own mind, as if I should have been familiar with this mysterious concept, like it was something of a common knowledge that is obvious to us all from birth. At that time, in that place, while understanding something was subtly off with this whole conversation and Dr. Westman himself, I couldn't yet comprehend the scale of it all. Thus I remained quiet, opting to simply listen, hoping he'd continue his story. And that he did, for the final time. Now, as to how it is possible that such bridging between the subjective and the objective happened, I cannot know. I sense you thinking, but surely it was just in your head. Well, ultimately, I have no proof. I know what I saw, but as this encounter was so brief, so fleeting, I had no chance to document it. But I know it with absolute clarity myself. I was of clear mind, free of drugs or alcohol, and it had such a profound impact for me that I still continue on this path of searching for Sophia. He paused for a moment, sighed, and then added, now seemingly resigned from any hope of making anyone understand his experience, I saw her in the woods, searching for her sister. Dr. Westman did not speak much after that. We finished our drinks in silence, and after a while I felt the need for another lavatory break. I could have asked him questions in order to pry more information about his strange encounter with the so-called animating spirit, but in the end, as I was still woefully ignorant of paramelancholic currents, I thought myself as out of depth with him, and so remained quiet. Thus I got up and retreated into the hallway, leaving Dr. Westman alone with his thoughts, still staring at the empty stand. When I got back, he had left, sole reminders of his visit being several empty beer glasses standing lone on the table. I walked to the bartender and asked whether he'd said anything prior to his unconventional departure. No, miss, I don't think so. But I did hear him mutter something to himself. Something about Sophia, I think. I leaned forward on the desk. What was it exactly? He glanced at the empty seat, then looked at me, quizzical as to why I was so fascinated. I think it was something like, never forsake your search for Sophia, though I'm not sure to whom it was directed. He shrugged, maybe just his own musings. I leaned back, thanked him, and then asked for one more drink, as I thought I might as well conclude the evening by waiting for the musician to get back, to play one last song before my own leave. Thus I got my glass and went back to my original seat, the one Dr. Westman had mistakenly occupied just minutes prior. Some time passed as I sipped my drink in solitude, feeling the alcohol slowly get into my head. The bar was now empty of customers except for me. I had time to think on Dr. Westman's words, and while at the time they made no sense to me, I later concluded that his experience could only mean one thing, that there's something universal in man's psyche after all, that it was not only in Mr. Gloom's arts that such phenomena could be encountered. While I never made any contact with archetypal personifications myself, masculine or feminine, my later experiences in White's End proved that there's forces beyond this world so immense that even a partial lift of that separating veil is enough to drive one mad. Dr. Westman's obsessive enthusiasm about finding Sophia also coincided with Rick's later hypothesis, the one predicting that coming into contact with such a force will lead one into a mad search for something, and this something may vary. But in its purest form, it seems to be search for Sophia herself, whatever she ultimately is, or whatever this search ultimately means. For me, I was simply thrusted into these events by forces outside of my control. There never was any sort of celestial whispering force beckoning me to begin some grand adventure. I think that's how life happens to most people. Whether the tragedies are small or large, they impose themselves on us, and it's up to us alone to deal with them the best we can. And as for Dr. Westman, his obsessive search later reminded me of Rick's attempts at finding solace in arts and literature, of finding some sort of esoteric truth from paramelancholic phenomena. While by now I know better to try denying its existence, I'm not too sure whether any form of divine truth can be discovered from it. It simply happens, sometimes to us, or someone around us, like fate.